This will be the second video for APUSH on Thursday, April 30th. Within the limits allowed by the Neutrality Acts, Roosevelt worked to assist the Allies. He found creative ways to supply them with extra weapons and ships, and he appointed pro-Ally Republicans to head the Department of War and the Navy. He instituted the nation's first peacetime military draft. It becomes increasingly difficult to describe U.S. foreign policy as isolationist by the 1940s. In 1941, Roosevelt forced the Lend-Lease Act through Congress, which permitted the United States to lend armaments to England, which no longer had money to buy the tools of war. Roosevelt sent American ships into a war zone to protect Lend-Lease shipments, an act that could easily have provoked a German attack. Later in the year, the Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill met at the Atlantic Charter Conference. The Atlantic Charter declared the Allied war aims, which included disarmament, self-determination, freedom of the seas, and guarantees of each nation's security. Given all this activity in the European theater, it seems odd that Americans' entry into the war came not in Europe but in Asia. Japan entered into an alliance with the Axis with Italy and Germany in 1940. 1941, France had fallen to Germany, and the British were too busy fighting Hitler to block Japanese expansion, which had continued south into French Indochina, which is like where Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos are now. The United States responded to Japanese aggression by cutting off trade to Japan, which was dependent on foreign imports. The embargo included oil, which Japan needed to fuel its war machine. Despite peace talks in November 1941 between the United States and Japan to avoid war, the United States had broken Japan's secret communication codes and knew that Japan was planning to attack, but did not know the location. Sorry, I lost my place. Shoot. Secretary of War Henry Stimson encouraged Roosevelt to wait for the Japanese attack in order to guarantee popular support for the war at home. He didn't have to wait long, and the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii on December 7th, 1941, and U.S. participation in the war began officially. Alright, going into war. World War II. Looks like we'll probably have to do part of World War II today and the rest tomorrow, and we'll finish up the notes. World War II, complicated military strategy and the overcome of key battles played a big part in World War II. Unfortunately for you, you don't know much about them for the AP exam, nor did you know much about the many truly unspeakable horrors of the Nazi perpetrated in European Jews and homosexuals and dissidents with the Holocaust. You should know more about the various wartime conferences, however, when the Allies met to discuss military strategy in the eventual post-war situation. It was no secret that the grand alliance between the Soviet Union and the West was tenuous at best, held together by the threat of common enemy, but threatened by Stalin's impatience at the Allies' delay in opening a second front, while the Soviets bore the brunt of the Nazi onslaught. The first meeting of the Big Three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, took place in the Iranian capital of Tehran in November of 1943. It was here that they planned the Normandy invasion, D-Day, and agreed to divide and defeat Germany into occupation zones after the war. Stalin also agreed to enter the war against Japan once Hitler had been defeated. The Allies fought the Germans primarily in the Soviet Union and Mediterranean early until 1944, when Allied forces invaded occupied France on D-Day. The Soviet Union paid a huge price in human and material loss for their strategy, and after the war sought to recoup its losses by occupying East Europe. In the Pacific, both sides incurred huge losses in casualties. The Allies eventually won a war of attrition against the Germans, and the Americans accelerated the victory in the East by dropping 2 atomic bombs on Japan. As it had during the Civil War, World War I, and the New Deal, the government acquired more power than it had previously had. The War Productions Board allowed for the government to receive mobilization industry towards the war effort in return. Businesses were guaranteed generous profits. Rationing almost all of consumer goods were imposed. The government-sponsored scientific research directed at the improving weaponry, developing radar, and the atomic bomb during this period. The government also exerted greater control over labor. The Labor Disputes Act of 1943 passed in reaction to disconcerting numbers of strikes in essential industries and allowed the government to take over businesses deemed necessary to national security, which gave the government authority to settle labor disputes. Hollywood was enlisted to create numerous propaganda films, both to encourage support on the home front and to boost morale of the troops overseas. Not surprisingly, the size of the government more than tripled during the war. FDR signed the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940, which created the first peacetime draft in U.S. history and gave birth to the current incarnation of the Selective Service System, which ultimately provided about 10 million soldiers toward the war effort. Although the draft was discontinued in 1973 after the United States' involvement in Vietnam, the Selective Service System still remains in place. World War II affected almost every aspect of daily life at home and abroad. It created new opportunities and new tensions within American society. More than 1 million African Americans served in the U.S. military during World War II. but they lived and worked in segregated units. The U.S. Army was not desegregated until after the war. During the Truman administration in 1948, a popular image familiar to most Americans is that of Rosie the Riveter. Originally featured on a poster of the era, Rosie came to symbolize the millions of women who worked in war-related industrial jobs during World War II. Unfortunately for the causes of feminism, most women were expected to take off the coveralls and put the apron back on when soldiers came home. Again, as during World War I, the government restricted civil liberties. Probably the most tragic instance was internment of Japanese Americans from 1942 to 1945. Fearful the Japanese might serve as enemy agents within the U.S. borders, government imprisoned more than 110,000 Asian Americans, over two-thirds of whom had been born in the United States and were thus U.S. citizens. Some were not even of Japanese descent. None of those in turn were ever charged with a crime. Imprisonment was based entirely on ethnic background. The government placed these Japanese Americans in desolate prison camps far from the West Coast, where they feared Japanese invasion would take place. Most lost their homes and possessions as a result of the internment. The Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of both the evacuation and internment of Japanese Americans. As in the Schenck case in 1919, the court ruled that a citizen's civil liberties can be curtailed and even violated in times of war. Citizenship has its responsibilities as well as privileges, and in times of war the burden is always heavier. Compulsory exclusion of large groups of citizens from their homes, except under circumstances of duress, emergency, and peril, is inconsistent with our basic governmental institutions. But when under condition of modern warfare, our shores are threatened by hostile forces, the power to protect must be consummate with the threatened danger, wrote Justice Hugo Black in Kawamatsu versus U.S. It wasn't until 1988 the government apologized and was paid reparations of about $1.6 million to all the surviving people and their heirs. Okay. Let's go ahead and look at the concepts real quick, and then we're going to come on video. And then we're going to close this out for the day. So I'm kind of recap the New Deal concepts here. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal attempted to end the Great Depression by using the government power to provide relief to the poor, stimulate recovery, and reform the American economy. Radical union and populist movements pushed Roosevelt towards more extensive efforts to change the American economic system, while conservatives in Congress and the Supreme Court sought to limit the New Deal's scope. Although the New Deal did not end the Depression, it left a legacy of reforms in regulatory agencies and fostered a long-term political realignment in which many ethnic groups, African Americans, and working-class communities identified with the Democratic Party. The increased demand for war production and labor during World War II and the economic difficulties of the 1930s led many Americans to migrate to urban centers in search of economic opportunities. Into war foreign policy. In the years following World War I, the United States pursued a unilateral foreign policy that used international investment, peace treaties, and select military intervention to promote a vision of international order, even while maintaining U.S. isolationism. In the 1930s, while many Americans were concerned about the rise of fascism and totalitarianism, most opposed taking military action against the aggression of Nazi Germany and Japan until the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor drew the United States into World War II. World War II mobilization. The mass mobilization of American society helped end the Great Depression, and the country's strong industrial base played a pivotal role in winning the war by equipping and provisioning allies and millions of U.S. troops. Mobilization provided opportunities for women and minorities to improve their social and economic positions for the war's duration, while also leading debates over racial segregation. Wartime experiences also generated challenges to civil liberties, such as the internment of Japanese Americans. Migration to the United States from Mexico and elsewhere in the Western Hemisphere increased in spite of contradictory government policies towards Mexican integration. All right, and I think we'll save the rest for later, for tomorrow. Oh, y'all have a good